can still see the clouds of dust rising in the distance, the rumble of heavy machinery echoing through the valley. My name is James Whitford, and I inherited my family's vineyard just a year ago, tucked away in the rolling hills of Alder County, California. This was no ordinary vineyard. It dated back 4 generations, tended by my ancestors, who poured their hearts into every cluster of grapes. But on that morning, the morning that changed everything, I stood on the edge of my property, mouth agape, watching an army of bulldozers, excavators, and trucks roll in. They tore into the earth without mercy, flattening rows of vines that my grandfather himself had planted decades ago. Right there, on my heritage vineyard, they were erecting a series of luxury estates. 40 of them. Each one promised to be more opulent than the last. I had heard rumors that a local homeowners association, HOA, was expanding deeper into rural areas. Rumors are one thing, but seeing the devastation with my own eyes was something else entirely. My prized grapes lay crushed beneath steel treads. Sturdy trellises that once held premium Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, and Cabernet vines were uprooted as though they were mere weeds. The sight churned my stomach. I grabbed my phone, snapping pictures from the hillside. A single question blazed in my mind. How could anyone have approved such a project on my land? I owned these acres fair and square, complete with pristine deeds dating back to the early 1900s. Yet here they were, building roads, laying foundations, and digging trenches for new utility lines. That's when I spotted her, a woman in a tailored business suit, stepping out of a glossy SUV. She wore sunglasses that reflected the morning sun, and her posture radiated authority. She strode along the rows of construction vehicles, pointing, gesturing, rattling off orders to workers who jumped to comply. Even from far away, I sensed her confidence. Her name, I would soon discover, was Valentina Tran, a regional manager for the sprawling HOA that had quietly been devouring properties all across Alder County. Stepping forward, I tried to approach. A security guard stopped me with a curt hand signal. He said it was a restricted area and threatened to call the sheriff if I trespassed. My anger flared, but I held it in check. If there was one thing I had learned from my father, an old-school vineyard owner with a keen sense of justice, it was never to charge into a fight unprepared. In that moment, a chilling thought crept into my mind. Maybe they don't even realize I'm the rightful owner. Or worse, maybe they do know, and they simply don't care. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching the unstoppable progress of construction. Steel beams rose from the ground. Battered grapevines lay in a chaotic tangle. The smell of gasoline and churned soil lingered in the air, drowning out the sweet scent of earth and fruit that once defined this land. Eventually I turned away, fists clenched at my sides. I vowed to myself and to the spirits of my ancestors that I would stop this brazen invasion. But at that time, I didn't yet realize the depth of this scheme. Nor did I realize how powerful the HOA had become, or the extent of its connections in local government. And I certainly didn't suspect that I, James Whitford, possessed a hidden card so monumental it would shift the entire balance of power. Alder County may seem like a sleepy rural district, but beneath its picturesque charm lies a maze of land deals, historical quirks, and quietly tangled legalities. Our local seat of government sits in a quaint, old-style courthouse, the kind with a flag fluttering in front. Creaky wooden floors line the corridors. Overhead fans spin lazily to combat the California heat. After leaving the vineyard, I drove straight to the county records office, determined to find an explanation for this breach. My old truck rattled along the winding road into town, the memory of bulldozers still haunting me. I needed answers, and fast. Inside the records office, I was greeted by a musty smell and shelves overflowing with thick ledgers. A middle-aged clerk with wire-rimmed glasses asked for my business. I explained that I needed property documents, everything related to the Whitford Vineyard. She eyed me suspiciously, but fetched a stack of files anyway. As I flipped through them, my heart pounded. Most of the records looked correct. My father's signature on the last official deed transfer, the boundaries carefully drawn, the list of grape varieties we'd cultivated. But then I noticed a newly appended file that claimed a portion of our vineyard, exactly where the bulldozers were tearing up the land, had been rezoned for residential development. The document was dated barely a month ago. Impossible, I thought. The region had strict zoning laws to protect agricultural land. The rezoning process usually required public hearings, environmental assessments, and community input. Yet here it was, stamped and sealed. I requested to see any hearing transcripts or local ordinances that might have allowed it. The clerk fumbled, insisting those documents were not publicly available. Her tone suggested either ignorance or fear, or perhaps both. Dissatisfied, I exited the records office, carrying only my father's original deeds and a photocopy of the suspicious rezoning document. The blazing sun outside did little to soothe my agitation. If anything, it reminded me how vulnerable my vines were under the scorching heat, especially now that they'd been uprooted. Just then, I spotted a familiar face, Ronnie Hill, a fellow vineyard owner who had been on the losing side of a recent property dispute. He was leaning against his pickup, brow furrowed. "Ronnie," I called, "did you hear about my vineyard? They're tearing it apart to build estates." He nodded, his voice low. "I heard. Same folks tried messing with my place last year. I lost half my orchard because of their ridiculous HOA fines and property lines shifting overnight." I exhaled sharply. "How is this even possible?" He shrugged, defeat flashing in his eyes. "They have connections. The county planner's office, the mayor, maybe even the environmental board. I tried fighting them, but every door slammed shut. I've got a lawsuit in the works, but it's slow. Meanwhile, they keep building. Anger and determination surged within me. I'm not letting them get away with it this time." Ronnie gave me a sympathetic look. "I wish you luck. You'll need it." Those words lingered. I realized if they could steamroll Ronnie, one of the longest-standing orchard owners in the county, they could do the same to me. Unless I found a way to beat them at their own game. Climbing back into my truck, I sensed that time was not on my side. Every day, more vines would be destroyed, more cement poured. I needed allies, information, and a bulletproof strategy. Little did I know, a critical piece of the puzzle was hidden in my own attic, waiting to be discovered. Back home, I walked through rows of vines that remained untouched. My eyes lingered on each cluster of grapes, imagining how they'd be gone if the HOA had its way. The main house rose before me, a centuries-old structure with a wide veranda and creaking wooden shutters. It bore the marks of time and family history. That evening, I settled at the large oak desk in my father's old study. Dust motes danced in the golden light of sunset. I sifted through piles of documents, old letters, worn photographs, the ledger of wine sales from decades past. None of it explained how the HOA could claim a right to build. None of it offered an immediate solution. Frustrated, I climbed up to the attic. The cramped space smelled of mothballs and aged wood. Boxes, trunks, and old furniture cluttered every corner. I rummaged around, flipping open lids, scanning faded labels. My father had always told me, everything about our family's land is right here. We never throw away a single scrap. After an hour of searching, I found an ornate wooden chest bound with tarnished metal hinges. Inside lay a collection of deeds going back generations. One was dated 1892, signed by my great-great-grandfather, Ambrose Whitford, who had bought not just the vineyard, but a massive swath of land around it, land that spanned most of Alder County's farmland back then. At first, I skimmed over these documents out of curiosity. Then my pulse quickened. The descriptions of property lines were shockingly extensive. I followed the scrawling script, reading how Ambrose had purchased entire parcels that later formed the backbone of the county. Over the years, the Whitford family had portioned off sections, selling them to local farmers and the county government, often with clauses protecting farmland from commercial exploitation. But there was one peculiar clause that caught my eye. It stated that, should any of the land be illegally seized, subdivided, or misused in violation of the original terms, ownership of all the unsold or unleased parcels would revert immediately to the Whitford estate, essentially giving our family the power to reclaim massive swaths of the county if wrongdoing could be proven. I reread that paragraph 3 times, my heart hammering. If it held legal weight today, and if the HOA's development was in direct violation, it could mean I had not just a claim to my vineyard, but an overarching claim to nearly every inch of farmland they sought to control. Gripping the fragile papers, I felt a strange mix of excitement and disbelief. Could something this big have gone unnoticed for so long? Perhaps because no one had challenged it, or maybe because no one dared. Until now. I returned to the study, carefully flattening out the old deeds on my desk. I needed a legal expert to confirm the validity of these ancient clauses, someone who wouldn't be scared off by the HOA. As night fell, I made a list of contacts, lawyers, local historians, anyone who might help. Before turning in, I locked the documents in a fireproof box. My family's legacy had just become a potential weapon against the HOA. I gazed out the window at the moonlit vines and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll save you." Little did I know that across town, the HOA was ramping up its expansion, emboldened by new backroom deals. And so began the collision course between the unstoppable force of Valentina Tran's ambitious schemes and the immovable object of my hidden inheritance. The next morning, I drove to a nearby town in search of an attorney, rumored to be unafraid of powerful adversaries. His name was Dean Fulton, a well-known litigator with a reputation for taking on big corporations and winning. Some called him a maverick. Others called him a troublemaker. His office was a modest brick building, tucked away from the main street. The waiting room was cramped but clean. A tired-looking receptionist gave me a curt nod and asked me to wait. I clutched the fireproof box containing the precious deeds. My mind raced with possibilities. After a short wait, Dean ushered me into his office. He was a tall, wiry man in his late 40s, brown hair streaked with gray. His eyes were intense, scanning me as if gauging my sincerity. I wasted no time. I need to stop the HOA from building on my vineyard. They claim to have rezoned part of it, but I found proof that might override that. Dean folded his arms. What sort of proof? I opened the box and laid out the antique deeds. Dean's expression shifted from curiosity to astonishment as he read through them. His gaze flicked to me. Is this real? I believe so. My family kept meticulous records. It shows that legally, I may still own a huge portion of Alder County farmland. Dean ran his fingers over the crisp edges of the old parchment. A clause like this could be enforceable if the original covenants were never nullified, but it'd be a battle. HOA lawyers will argue these are outdated or superseded by modern zoning laws. I sighed. I figured it wouldn't be simple. But if we can prove corruption or illegal reclassification, then the old covenants would kick in, right? He nodded. Potentially, yes. The question is, do you have evidence that the HOA's rezoning or expansions are illegitimate? I recounted the suspicious files from the county records office, the clerk's evasive behavior, and Ronnie's experiences. Dean's eyes narrowed. Seems like the HOA, or at least some key members, might be greasing palms. We can start by issuing Freedom of Information Act requests, digging into the county's communications. Then we'll see if we can catch them in the act. His sudden grin caught me off guard. If this pans out, you'd have the legal right to freeze their entire operation across the county. They have no idea how big of a bombshell this is. A flicker of hope lit my chest. You'll take the case? Dean leaned forward, resting his elbows on his cluttered desk. Absolutely. I live for this kind of fight. But be warned, if you poke the hornet's nest, expect retaliation. I nodded resolutely. I'm ready. As I left Dean's office, a renewed sense of purpose coursed through my veins. The next step was to gather irrefutable proof of the HOA's wrongdoing. Only then could we wield my family's ancient covenant like a sledgehammer, smashing through any legal obstacles. A week later, I found myself standing outside the half-constructed estate roads that now scarred my vineyard. The roar of machinery was incessant. Dust drifted into the air like a constant reminder of the intrusion. Workers in hard hats scurried around, pouring foundations and erecting wooden frames for the new mansions. I had returned with Dean, who insisted we assess the site in person. He wanted to see the extent of the damage and gather photographic evidence for our case. Dressed in a casual shirt and jeans, I felt a pang of sadness looking at the ruined vines. Without warning, Valentina Tran appeared, stepping around a cement mixer with her usual confident stride. She wore a sleek business suit that seemed at odds with the dusty surroundings. Two of her associates followed close behind, stern-faced men in matching suits. "Mr. Whitford," she greeted, adjusting her sunglasses. "I didn't expect to see you here again." I fought the urge to let my anger flare. I had to maintain composure. "I have every right to check on my property. You've made quite a mess here." Valentina's lips curled into a polite but dismissive smile. "Our permits are in order. If you have an issue, you can take it up with the county offices. We're providing high-end housing, boosting the local economy." Dean cleared his throat, flipping open a small leather folder. "Actually, we have reason to believe your rezoning permits might not be valid, and that you've overstepped the original covenants protecting this land. We'd like to see all relevant documentation, Ms. Tran." She glanced at Dean as if he were an annoying fly. "I'm not obligated to show you anything without a court order, Mr. Fulton. Dean Fulton, attorney representing James Whitford," he said, extending a business card. Valentina snatched it without a word, gave it a quick glance, and handed it to one of her associates. "Well, Mr. Fulton, you and your client can try whatever legal avenues you want, but the HOA's expansions have already been greenlit by the county. We're just executing our approved plans." I couldn't help but scoff. "Approved by who? You bulldozed my grandfather's vines and destroyed generations of heritage." Valentina's sunglasses hid her eyes, but I sensed her annoyance. "Progress requires sacrifice, especially if the land has more profitable uses. You should be thanking us. These estates will increase property values across the region." Dean raised an eyebrow. "That depends on whether the developments are lawful. We'll see you in court if necessary." Her veneer of politeness vanished momentarily. "Then I suggest you gather substantial evidence, because once we bring our lawyers and county supporters to bear, you'll be lucky if you don't end up losing every acre." With that, she pivoted on her heels and strode away, her associates following like loyal shadows. I clenched my fists. My vineyard was being treated like a mere commodity, my family's legacy reduced to a spreadsheet value. Dean placed a hand on my shoulder. "Stay calm, we'll get her." People like Valentina rely on intimidation, but once we shine enough light on her deals, she'll have nowhere to hide. I swallowed hard, pushing down the anger that threatened to boil over. "Let's gather all the evidence we can," I said. "I won't back down." Yet deep down, I knew this battle would be more than a simple lawsuit. We were poking a beast that thrived on hidden alliances and local corruption. If I didn't tread carefully, the consequences could be dire. For me, for Dean, and for everyone else Valentina's HOA had crushed beneath its unstoppable expansion. Alder County's once quiet streets buzzed with rumors. Valentina Tran's HOA expansions weren't limited to my vineyard. They had their sights on other properties too. Orchards, ranches, and even small suburban developments near the county line. Everywhere I heard the same complaints: sudden zoning changes, unexplained fines, forced buyouts. Dean and I began visiting town halls, collecting statements from frustrated landowners. Some shared stories of how they'd been levied with outrageous fees for minor infractions, like a fence an inch too high or a paint color not on the approved list. Others described how they'd been strong-armed into selling after the HOA made their living situations untenable. One farmer, a soft-spoken older man named Carl Jenkins, told us how the HOA threatened to cut off his water supply if he didn't sell at their price. Tears welled in his eyes when he recalled how his orchard had withered after they hiked utility rates. "I've worked that land for 30 years, Carl said, voice trembling with quiet rage, "and they practically forced me out. Now they're building a subdivision of cookie-cutter houses on what used to be a thriving grove." Dean jotted down notes. I clenched my teeth at the blatant injustice. "Carl, we're building a case. This evidence of intimidation can be powerful if we present it properly." Carl nodded, hope flickering in his gaze. "I'll help in any way I can. Just promise me, don't let them do to you what they did to me." I swallowed hard, recalling my bulldozed vines. "We're trying, Carl." But a pattern was emerging. For each property the HOA claimed, the county offices magically produced new permits or reclassifications to smooth the process. The question was, why was the county cooperating? One name kept popping up: a certain county supervisor named Alan Glover, rumored to have a very cozy relationship with Valentina. Allegations of bribes, hidden land deals, and rigged hearings swirled like smoke, nothing proven, but widely gossiped. Dean was thorough, filing Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests to unearth any emails or memos linking the supervisor's office to the HOA. Meanwhile, I worked my own network: old family friends, other vineyard owners, and people who had known the Whitfords for generations. I needed them to confirm the authenticity and scope of my family's century-old covenant. Slowly but surely, the puzzle pieces began to fit together. We discovered that the county's so-called public hearings were announced at odd hours or held in obscure locations so that only a handful of HOA insiders showed up, allowing them to rubber stamp the expansions. Environmental impact studies were either ignored or forged to expedite permits. But even as we collected this damning evidence, I felt the weight of time pressing down on me. Every day the construction in my vineyard pressed forward. New estates rose from the rubble of my grandfather's vines. The clock was ticking, and the big question remained: would we be ready to confront them before the damage was irreversible? Late one evening, after a grueling day of meetings and research, I parked my truck outside my farmhouse. The night sky was clear, the stars glimmered overhead, a stark contrast to the turmoil boiling in my mind. I noticed my porch light was off. Odd, since I always left it on when I went out. Walking up the steps, I felt a prickle of unease. Sure enough, the door was slightly ajar, the lock hanging crooked. Tension coiled in my gut. Carefully, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The living room lamp was on, revealing a scene of mild disarray. Cushions tossed off the couch, papers scattered over the hardwood floor. My father's old rifle display case had been yanked open, the antique weapon left behind but rummaged through. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response. My heart hammered as I checked each room. Luckily, no one was there now. I hurried to the study, flinging the door open. The drawers to the oak desk were ransacked. Books on viticulture and old photo albums lay strewn about, but the fireproof box was still locked, tucked in a hidden compartment. I let out a shaky exhale. They hadn't found it. Still, this was no random burglary. Someone was searching for the covenants, no doubt trying to destroy or steal them before I could present them in court. My chest tightened with anger and fear. How far would the HOA or its cronies go to protect their scheme? The local sheriff came by within the hour, took my statement, scribbled some notes, and promised to look into it. His tone was polite, but his eyes hinted at resignation. Break-ins were rare out here, and catching the culprit might not be a priority. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. If they were bold enough to break in, I had to assume they'd stop at nothing. I texted Dean. "Break in at my place. They were looking for the deeds. I'm okay, but things got messy." His reply came swiftly. "Secure the docks offsite. Don't leave them there. We'll file an injunction ASAP." I stared at the bullet holes in the display case, the battered lock on my front door. Anger burned in my chest, but beneath it lay a steely resolve. They might have tried to scare me, to rattle me into backing off, but this only fueled my determination to expose them. No matter what, I wasn't going to let the memory of my ancestors be trampled under the greed of corrupt officials. Nor would I abandon the many neighbors and fellow farmers who had suffered the HOA's extortion. I had come too far to turn back now. Under Dean's guidance, we set our legal plan into motion. We filed preliminary complaints in the county courts, accusing the HOA of illegal land grabs, fraudulent rezoning, and possible bribery of local officials. We attached affidavits from Carl Jenkins and other affected neighbors. We also hinted at the existence of the old Whitford covenants, a trump card we would fully reveal once we had the right stage. Surprisingly, the county courthouse assigned an initial hearing date a mere 2 weeks away. Dean speculated this was due to outside pressure, or maybe some judge wanting to appear unbiased. Whatever the reason, we seized the opportunity. Meanwhile, the community quietly rallied. People who had once lost hope began sharing stories of harassment or manipulative tactics by the HOA. Anonymous tips trickled in, suggesting that Supervisor Glover was receiving under-the-table payments from Valentina's associates in exchange for pushing zoning changes. I spent hours reviewing files in Dean's office. He would pace the floor, reading new documents out loud, sometimes stopping mid-sentence for a well-placed semicolon, an odd habit he had when emphasizing a point. We both knew that beyond the lawsuit, We needed public awareness. If we could get the media involved, it might accelerate accountability for crooked officials. So I reached out to a local reporter named Tara Fields, one of the few journalists brave enough to dig into contentious stories. She met me at a nearby cafe, wearing a pressed blouse and an air of sharp curiosity. Over steaming cups of coffee, I laid out the basics: the break-in, the rezoning anomalies, the suspicious alignments of county officials. Tara's eyes lit up. "This is huge," she said, her excitement barely contained. "If half of this is true, the HOA and local government could be facing massive scandals. Do you have proof?" I carefully showed her some sanitized sections of the old deeds and the official correspondences we'd acquired via FOIA. Tara flipped through them, occasionally snapping pictures with her phone. "I'll need corroboration," she cautioned, "but I'll start an investigation, see what I can dig up from City Hall. If I find anything solid, we can blow this wide open." As she left, I felt a sense of vindication. Perhaps at last, the stories of those who'd been bullied by the HOA would reach the public. Still, my nights remained restless. Even with the community's support growing, the reality was that the HOA's construction was still underway, forging ahead with those 40 estates on my once thriving vineyard. Valentina was relentless, already pre-selling the units to wealthy buyers from out of state. Even more troubling, the local sheriff's investigation into the break-in had yielded no progress. If my suspicions were correct, we were dealing with well-connected criminals willing to cross any line. I kept the old deeds locked away in an undisclosed location, my best insurance policy. I could feel the storm brewing. The thunder of confrontation rolled in the distance. The upcoming court hearing would be the first test of our evidence. But deep inside, I sensed that Valentina and her allies had a few tricks of their own. The day of the hearing, I arrived at the county courthouse in a suit that felt slightly too stiff. Dean, impeccably dressed and armed with a leather-bound binder, led the way up the worn marble steps. The building's age reminded me of the deep roots my family had in this place. Inside, the hearing room was small but packed with interested locals, many of whom had also been victimized by the HOA. I spotted Carl Jenkins, Ronnie Hill, and others from the community. Tara Fields sat in the back, pen and notepad at the ready, her eyes scanning the crowd. Valentina entered with an entourage of lawyers, 3 of them, all in tailored suits. Her confident stride and poised demeanor radiated power. I caught her eye for a moment, and she flashed a chilling smile. It was as if she was silently mocking the entire proceeding. The judge called the session to order. Dean presented a concise argument that the HOA's rezoning and construction on my vineyard was unlawful, that the county had skirted due process. He hinted at the possibility of bribery, but didn't fully reveal the old deeds yet. Valentina's lead counsel, a slick-talking attorney named Raymond Clark, countered with a barrage of legal jargon. He dismissed our claims as baseless, insisted the HOA had followed every regulation. He even produced documents, likely doctored, that showed a trail of approvals. Then came the ambush. Raymond presented a motion to dismiss our complaint entirely, claiming we lacked standing. My client legally purchased development rights from the previous owners, who had every right to sell. Mr. Whitford's father apparently signed a partial easement years ago, permitting future residential use. A hush fell over the room. I glanced at Dean in confusion. "What is he talking about?" I whispered. Dean's brow furrowed. "Let us decide. This is the first we've heard of such an easement." Raymond smirked. "We only discovered it in archived county records last week." He handed the judge a copy. This easement predates Mr. Whitford's inheritance. By law, it grants the HOA the authority to develop up to 40 estates on the land. The judge studied the document, looking conflicted. My heart pounded. Could my father have signed something unwittingly? Or was this another forgery? Dean requested time to review the new evidence. The judge granted a brief recess. We huddled in a corner, scanning the so-called easement. Dean's face darkened. This signature is a near-perfect match for your father's, but the language is suspiciously vague, and the date is off by a year from when your father was hospitalized. Rage boiled in my gut. I knew in my bones this was a fake. Yet, forging my father's signature was the lowest of the low. After recess, Dean argued that the document was likely fraudulent, but the judge seemed uneasy. He postponed a final ruling, giving us 2 weeks to provide definitive proof. The HOA and Valentina's team wore smug expressions as they left the courtroom. I slumped onto a bench, head in my hands. We'd been outmaneuvered, at least for now. Dean patted my shoulder. We'll challenge this easement. We'll get a handwriting expert, track down witnesses from that time. Don't lose hope. But my faith in the system wavered. If the HOA could produce fake documents so easily, what else were they capable of? As the crowd thinned, Tara approached. That seemed rough. Are you okay? I mustered a weary nod. We'll fight it. I'm not giving up. Her determined smile offered a glimmer of hope. You shouldn't. The people here need someone willing to stand up to them. Yet as I walked out of the courthouse, I felt like David facing Goliath. The old deeds in my possession were powerful. But how could we counter the HOA's ability to conjure bogus paperwork? Still, I refused to let them break me. I had a family legacy to uphold, and as I stared at the historical Whitford crest on my ring, I vowed, they have no idea who they're up against. Late that night, I collapsed onto my bed, exhaustion pulling me under. But around 2 a.m., I jolted awake to the blare of my phone. A frantic voice crackled on the other end. It was Ronnie Hill shouting about flames in the lower fields. My vineyard was on fire. I raced outside into the moonlit darkness. The horizon glowed an ominous orange. Thick smoke billowed above the rows of vines near the construction site. Heart pounding, I jumped into my truck, speeding down the dirt road as fast as it could handle. When I arrived, a group of firefighters was already battling the blaze. Flames licked the wooden frames of one partially built estate, and the fire spread dangerously close to the healthy vines that remained untouched by the bulldozers. Sparks danced in the night air. The heat was suffocating. I spotted Valentina at a distance, shouting commands at her own private security. One of her suits tried to stop me from entering the site, but I pushed past him, desperate to get closer. "Stay back," a firefighter yelled. "It's not safe." Smoke stung my eyes. The acrid smell burned my throat. I could barely see through the haze. In the chaos, I heard shouting. Someone accusing the HOA of negligence. Someone else blaming me for sabotage. My gut twisted. Could the HOA have set this fire to blame me? Or was it an accident at the construction site? Perhaps some worker had left a generator running near flammable materials. The possibilities swirled in my mind. Eventually, the firefighters managed to contain the fire, preventing it from spreading to my remaining vines. The half-finished estate was reduced to charred beams and blackened rubble. Coughing, tears streaming from smoke irritation, I stumbled toward Valentina. Her face was streaked with soot, her elegant suit now smudged with ash. She locked eyes with me, fury radiating from her gaze. "You," she hissed. How dare you sabotage our progress? I reeled in disbelief. Are you insane? I'd never burn my own vines. My family's livelihood. She scoffed. It's convenient that the fire destroyed only one of our structures. Maybe you wanted to make a statement. My voice trembled with anger. Why would I risk everything I have left just to burn a mansion that's hardly finished? Her security details circled us, tension crackling in the smoky air. For a heartbeat, it felt like we might come to blows right then and there. But a weary firefighter stepped between us, pushing us apart. Take this argument somewhere else, he rasped. We've got a job to do. I backed off, adrenaline still surging. This was beyond property disputes now. The Vineyard, the place my ancestors had cherished, was turning into a battleground. And the next day, I knew Valentina would spin this fire to her advantage, fueling her narrative that I was a reckless agitator. As I returned to my farmhouse, the faint glow of embers still visible in the distance, a sobering realization washed over me. The gloves were off. Valentina and her associates would stop at nothing, and neither would I. The fire triggered a wave of investigations. The county fire department, insurance adjusters, even a private investigator hired by the HOA. Amid the chaos, Dean and I accelerated our own efforts. We scoured the newly surfaced easement, trying to prove its illegitimacy. Bit by bit, we found cracks in the HOA's armor. A forensic document expert confirmed irregularities in the signature's ink, suggesting it was created recently, not decades ago when my father supposedly signed. A bank teller who recognized my father from years back testified that at the time the document was dated, my father was bedridden in the hospital, unable to walk or sign anything. All the while, Tara's reporting brought new whistleblowers out of hiding. Anonymous county employees leaked emails showing Supervisor Glover's suspiciously timed campaign donations from shell companies tied to Valentina. The puzzle of how the HOA got their permits rubber-stamped began to take a clear shape. Bribery, collusion, and forged paperwork. Yet the biggest ace in the hole remained my family's ancient covenants. Dean and I decided we'd present them publicly once we had ironclad proof of the HOA's fraud. If the entire rezoning was illegitimate, those covenants would automatically revert massive portions of the land to my ownership. In a tense phone call with me, Dean laid it out. If the court acknowledges the reversion clause, you effectively control the farmland that these estates sit on. Their precious project could be rendered illegal overnight. My heart pounded as I imagined the implications. That means I could, in theory, evict them from any land that was improperly sold or developed? Precisely. But we must do this carefully. We have to show the HOA knowingly built on land they didn't legitimately own. If the judge rules in our favor, it's game over for Valentina. Fear mingled with excitement. Controlling that much land was a tremendous responsibility, but also a powerful tool against corruption. I recalled the sorrow in Carl Jenkins' eyes, the heartbreak of losing his orchard. If this covenant was enforced, I could rectify injustices done to others too. Meanwhile, the county rescheduled our hearing to a larger courtroom, anticipating the intense public interest. Valentina's team brazenly declared they would crush frivolous claims and threatened to sue me for the cost of the burned-down mansion. But the tide was turning. Public sentiment swung in my favor as Tara's articles exposed shady deals. Protesters picketed outside the half-finished estates, holding signs that read, "Save our vineyards," and "Stop the fraud." On the eve of the hearing, I stashed the original Whitford covenants in a safety deposit box at a bank in the next county, beyond Valentina's reach. I sensed she was growing desperate. The break-in, the suspicious fire, the forged documents. She was playing a dangerous game. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I paced the farmhouse, picturing my grandfather walking among the vines, teaching me how to prune them, how to love and respect the land. It all came down to this. If we won, I could restore the vineyard and help countless families. If we lost, the HOA would gain unstoppable momentum, bulldozing heritage and farmland across the county. I paused at the window, gazing at the moonlit vines. I pressed my hand against the glass and whispered, "I won't fail you." The morning of the hearing dawned bright and clear, a deceptive calm before the storm. Dean and I arrived at the courthouse early, flanked by local supporters. Even from the steps outside, we could hear the commotion within. The public gallery was overflowing. News cameras lined the entrance. Inside, the judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, called for order. Valentina sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, flanked by Raymond Clark and a cadre of lawyers. Supervisor Glover was conspicuously absent, rumored to be under investigation for ethics violation. Dean presented our case meticulously, first demonstrating the forgery of the alleged easement. Our document expert took the stand, explaining the anachronistic ink and the mismatch in the historical timeline. Next, a nurse from the hospital testified that my father couldn't have signed anything during the dates in question. The judge's sharp eyes flashed with disapproval as each piece of evidence chipped away at the HOA's claims. Then came the big moment. Dean introduced the Whitford Covenants. I watched Valentina's face as the old deeds were handed to the judge. Her expression wavered from dismissal to alarm as Dean explained the reversion clause in plain English. He detailed how, if the rezoning was proven invalid, the land automatically reverted to the rightful Whitford ownership, nullifying the HOA's developments. Valentina's lawyers scrambled, objecting on grounds of irrelevance, claiming the documents were too old or overridden by modern statutes. But Dean cited case law affirming that original covenants can remain binding if never officially rescinded. When the judge asked how the reversion clause applied specifically to the vineyard, Dean pulled out maps showing the overlapping parcels. "Your Honor," he said, "the evidence indicates the HOA willfully built on farmland they knew was protected under the original covenants. By forging documents, they attempted to bypass these protections. Under the law, that triggers immediate reversion of these parcels to my client." An anxious hush fell over the courtroom. For the first time, Valentina spoke directly, her voice laced with controlled anger. "This is absurd. These ancient deeds cannot possibly hold up against the modern development rights we lawfully acquired." Dean turned to her, eyes cold. "Lawfully, Ms. Tran. You presented a forged easement. You bribed officials. You deceived the county. The law doesn't look kindly on such tactics." The judge silenced them with a firm gavel. "Strike. I've heard enough. I will review the evidence thoroughly and deliver a ruling soon. Court adjourned." A collective exhale swept through the room. Valentina stormed out with her attorneys, ignoring reporters' questions. I remained by the defense table, my hands trembling with a mixture of anxiety and triumph. Carl Jenkins and Ronnie Hill approached, tears in their eyes. "You did it, James," Ronnie whispered. "Win or lose, you exposed them." I nodded, overwhelmed, yet a sliver of doubt nagged at me. Had we done enough? Even if the judge ruled in our favor, the HOA could file appeals. They had deep pockets and cunning lawyers. But for now, we had shaken their foundation. The next step was in the judge's hands. Outside, the sun was blinding and the air carried a sense of anticipation. Reporters crowded around, microphones and cameras shoved in my face. "Mr. Whitford, is it true you'll evict the HOA from all the estates?" one asked. "I just want my family's land protected and justice for everyone who's been wronged," I answered, voice steady despite my inner turmoil. If that means stopping their illegal developments, so be it. With that, I pushed through the crowd, heading to my truck. My phone buzzed with supportive messages from neighbors and texts from Dean praising our performance in court. For the first time in weeks, I allowed a faint smile. We might actually win this fight. It took several tense weeks before the judge delivered her ruling, a written decision that arrived by courier on a sun-drenched afternoon. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope. Dean stood beside me on the farmhouse porch, his jaw tight. The words on the page blurred momentarily, then I read them aloud. The court finds that the easement presented by the HOA is invalid, being established upon forged documentation. Furthermore, given the evidence of bribery and improper rezoning, the original Whitford covenants remain in effect. The contested lands revert to James Whitford under the reversion clause. I paused, heart pounding, then continued. The construction permits issued by the county are hereby revoked, pending further review. The development known as Valley Estates at Whitford Vineyard must cease operations immediately. Any continued building will be considered trespassing. A cheer erupted from behind us as Carl Jenkins, Ronnie Hill, and a handful of neighbors who had been waiting around the porch heard the verdict. Relief and joy swept through me. After so much struggle, so many nights of fear and anger, I had finally won. In the days that followed, officials from the state and possibly even the federal level swarmed Alder County, investigating corruption. Supervisor Glover resigned under a cloud of scandal. Valentina faced multiple lawsuits for fraud, for bribery, for forging official documents. The half-built estates on my vineyard were declared illegal structures. Some were demolished. A few were converted into community projects with my blessing, once we hammered out legitimate agreements. Meanwhile, the old Whitford covenants gave me authority to reclaim farmland that had been stolen or seized through nefarious means. Instead of hoarding that power, I chose to do what my ancestors would have wanted, restore the farmland to its rightful owners. Families like Carl Jenkins, who had been forced out, returned to their orchards. Others joined a cooperative arrangement, ensuring that no single entity, HOA or otherwise, could abuse them again. With the vineyard free of construction, I began the long process of replanting. It would take years to rebuild what had been lost, but a renewed sense of purpose filled my every step. I hired workers from the community, many of whom had lost jobs when the HOA's developments collapsed. Together, we turned rubble into fertile ground. On a bright autumn morning, I invited everyone to the vineyard for a celebration. Barrels of fresh grape juice lined the edge of the field. Tables groaned under plates of local produce. Children ran among the rows of budding vines, laughter replacing the roar of bulldozers. Dean arrived, shaking my hand with a broad grin. "We did it, James," he said, relief shining in his eyes. "It's not often the little guy beats a giant, but you had the law and a century of Whitford history on your side." I raised a glass. To all of us who stood up, we protected what matters most. Carl Jenkins and Ronnie Hill lifted their cups in unison. Someone started a toast, and the crowd joined in, voices warm and united. As the sun dipped below the rolling hills of Alder County, I wandered to a hilltop overlooking the vineyard. The sight was breathtaking. The fresh rows of young vines, the patchwork of farmland extending as far as the eye could see, each parcel now free from the HOA's grip. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the faint scent of grapes and fertile earth. I thought of my father, my grandfather, and all the Whitfords who had poured their souls into this land. I imagined them smiling down, proud that their covenant still protected the community from greed and exploitation. My phone buzzed with a media request. Reporters clamoring for comments on how one man took down a corrupt HOA. I chuckled softly. It had never been just about me. It was about everyone who dared to say enough, about a legacy that transcended time and greed, about families who deserved to thrive on their land without fear. Smiling, I stepped off the hilltop to rejoin the celebration. In the golden twilight, I saw neighbors dancing, children playing, and the vines standing tall, symbols of resilience. For the first time in a long while, my heart felt light. If you enjoyed this story or found strength in its message, feel free to share it with friends, subscribe to our channel for more tales of justice and community, and click the like button to spread the word. Let's keep standing up for what's right.